I'm Catherine Nichols, Interim Assistant Director, and I'm joined in welcoming you by Elizabeth Hopwood, Acting Director for the Center. And so this is a different format for us. Many of you have attended our in-person lunchtime lectures, and so we miss the in-person socializing and the food, but we're really grateful for the affordances of the virtual format, which has been allowing us to invite non-local speakers and more easily share with folks that have been unable to make it to campus. So all the way from Australia. We'll continue to send out emails with information about upcoming speakers, and we hope you continue to Zoom in. So just a few housekeeping notes. We're going to mute the audience and disable the chat for now. This helps us provide a distraction-free environment for our speaker. We'll enable the chat for the Q&A, and Andrew French, one of our fellows, will read questions. So you can also ask a question yourself or make a comment by raising your hand. And you can use the raise hand feature of Zoom, or there are many of you. So if your camera is on and Andrew sees you on his page, you can also sort of motion as well to be called on. We'll record the session and post to our social media pages. And so just keep in mind that digital technology, possible technical challenges, but we've been doing this for a while and it seems to be working well, but please let us know if there are any problems. And I'll hand it off to Dr. Marta Werner, Scholarly Chair in Textual Studies, who will introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz and Catherine, for hosting this series at the Center for Textual Studies and Digital Humanities, and for giving us the chance to hear from scholars working across diverse fields, but meeting in the wonderfully capacious field of the digital humanities. And many, many thanks to all of you who've come here today and on so many other days. You make these events possible, and together we are also a community. I am so excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Isabella Magni. Currently postdoctoral associate in digital humanities and Italian at Rutgers University, Magni's research and teaching explores the intersection between literary studies, philology, history, and digital humanities. Two of her many recent scholarly publications, Teaching the Divine Comedy from its Manuscripts in MLA's 2020 Approaches to Teaching Dante, and From Codex to Code, New Perspectives in the Study of the Materiality of Medieval Texts, forthcoming in Digital Philology later this fall, suggest the range of her thinking about how technologies, old and new, from manuscript to print to digital, transform the way we produce, read, and interpret texts. The authority, and I would also say the joy, that Magni brings to her work is the result of rigorous preparation. After completing her undergraduate studies at the Universitate del Sacro Cuore in Milano, and forgive my terrible pronunciation, she traveled to the US where she earned a PhD at Indiana University Bloomington, specializing in medieval and Renaissance Italian literature and manuscript culture and digital humanities. As an advanced doctoral candidate, Magni joined Wayne Story and John Walsh's small team of scholarly collaborators working on the Petrarch, an NEH-funded digital edition and archive of Petrarch's songbook, applying her study of paleography and the digital representation of texts to the art of transcribing and encoding the rerum vulgarium fragmenta. These skills and these arts she would put to use again when she won a 2-year Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at Newberry Library's Center for Renaissance Studies, where her work included the design and building of the library's interactive site, Italian Paleography, a new digital resource to teach, learn, and practice how to read and contextualize primary sources from the 14th to the 18th century. And I must say, incidentally, that when I took my seminar to the Newberry last year, my greatest claim to fame was that I knew Isabella Magni. They didn't care at all about me, but knowing Isabella was a foot in the door there, and she's much missed. It was also at the Newbery that Magni discovered her current digital scholarly project. Her talk today on the Albizi Memorial Book, one of the rare first-hand accounts of the Black Death composed by someone who lost almost half of his family to the disease, is a moving reminder that manuscripts have so much to tell us about the cultural and historical context in which they were written. But it is also, and equally, a testimony to the ways in which digital humanities allows these material objects to live again and speak to us in our own strange and troubled time. Thank you, Isabella, for coming. I very happily yield the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta, for this wonderful introduction. Let me share my screen so that we can start. Here we go. So first and foremost, I wish to thank you, Marta, Professor Werner, and everyone really at the Loyola Center for Textual Studies and Digital Humanities, Catherine, Liz, and everybody for organizing this talk. I have to say that during my 2 years at the Newbery Library, sometimes I joined these talks at Loyola, so I'm very happy today to be here with you again, virtually. And I wish to thank, if you allow me, mostly graduate students and all the students at all levels that are here today, that are powering through these difficult times. I am always in awe of your resilience, your enthusiasm, and you are indeed the future of the humanities and of humanity in and outside of academia. So thank you for taking the time to be here and listen to me and share with me your thoughts. So we are all living through truly historical moments, as we all well know, for many different reasons. And this really reminds me of the importance of studying and talking about history, literature, the arts, and examining and re-examining the objects of history, in this case, manuscripts, and the importance to do so publicly. And in this, I believe the digital can help us talk to broader publics. And I think today is clearer more than ever how important this work is beyond the walls of academia. So this reflection might sound, and perhaps are, a bit aspirational, but I think are becoming more and more essential in our roles as researchers, as teachers, as educators. But let's start. I want to touch briefly on a couple of issues today. I'll first talk about the document. Probably most of you are not familiar with medieval Italian or the Albizi family, so I'll briefly introduce this extraordinary object and then talk to you a little bit about the initial phases of conceptualizing and building the digital edition. Just a big quick warning, it's a fairly new project, so it's still in its early developmental stages, but I truly think it's important to talk about digital projects even when they are not launched yet. We are often used to talk about digital projects when we have the website ready, when we feel comfortable enough sharing our digital work, but I really think it's important to talk about all the phases of the project and not to be scared off if we feel we are not ready enough to talk also about the digital side. Because for us, for sure, for feedback, but also to share with younger scholar, older scholar, to everybody that this is an ongoing process. It's a long process, and there is no shame in talking about something that is completely ongoing. It's actually quite helpful. So before talking about the manuscript, I want to touch on a couple of things. So where did this project come from for me? How did I get the idea of starting to build a digital edition of these manuscripts? Well, from two very, very simple facts that probably everybody encountered in their life as a graduate student or researcher. One is material and one is digital. Material, the most classic one for textual scholars, going to an archive. In my case, the archive is the Newberry Library. And in my case, the trip to the archive was very luckily quite long, 2 years long. I know that was I was very lucky to be with this manuscript and with the Newberry collection for 2 full years. So I really got to experience really the depth of our North American collections. We often, especially for literary scholars, textual scholars that focus on European texts, we often strive to go all the way to Europe and search those wonderful collections, but we often forget how many gems and how much depth there is in a lot of North American archives. So my first suggestion, go out and look at archives. You never know what you can find. And I was really lucky to find this extraordinary manuscript during my time at the Newberry. The second is digital. The second way in which I started thinking about this new project. It's the project that Marta already mentioned. It's Italian Paleography. During my 2 years at the Newberry, I worked on building a website, and the website includes 102 different manuscripts, around 80 from the Newberry Library and 20 from other North American institutions and archives. And one of the 102 manuscripts that I worked on was the Albizi project. So this is also quite common, I would say, that working on a digital project with colleagues from different areas, working interdisciplinary, it often gives you ideas to start a new project. Second tip, don't be afraid, collaborate on projects, and for professors, involve graduate students in your digital projects, because there is a lot to learn from there. And I will be forever grateful to Professor Wayne Story and Professor John Walsh for giving me the opportunity to really work on the field and learn on the field my digital thinking. And we'll see what I mean with that. Okay, so with these 2 premises, I would love to start talking about the manuscript. So what is this manuscript? Probably most of you are not familiar with it, so here we go. So Newberry Vault, oversized case MS-27, and this is the cover, the wonderful cover of the book, is a memorial book, partly ledger and partly diary, that belonged to and was written by Pepo degli Albizi in the 14th century. Most of you probably are not familiar with the Albizi family, but so I'll just give a brief overview of who they were. They were one of the most powerful families of medieval Florence. The Albizi were active members of the wool guilds, l'arte della lana, and most prosperous between 13th and 16th century, I would say. Their main business was the production, refinement, and commerce of wool. They sold and traded locally in Florence and beyond the walls of the city. Venice, Flanders, and England were 3 of their most prolific markets. And here is the coat of arms of the family. And here is, if you go around Florence today, there are still a lot of signs of the Albizi family, including a street name, still named on them, and some palaces as well. So they're still right there. The family business, though, was run out of the city in 2 fondaco and botteghe, funny mills, a commercial presence that was quite exceptional for wool businesses of the time. It was quite big, certainly a sign of the scale and power of the family business in the 14th century, and they are still there, almost intact. right on the hills outside of Florence. So the family not only sold and produced panni, so wool products, but they were also granting loans to other families and businesses. They were selling and renting land, selling and renting funning mills and factories, mostly located in the surrounding, in the hills surrounding Florence. So the family occupied really a strong economic position in the wool guild, and also contributed to shaping the guild's policies and governing laws. Guild records from the archives in Florence, the Archivio di Stato, show that the Albizi were actually among the most active in the government of the Arte della Lana wool guild, with a significant number of family members involved in its cabinet. 21, for example, in 1332 and 18 in 1353, just to mention two of the most prolific years. And these are quite extraordinary numbers, even if they seem small to us now. The Albizi were also directly involved in governing the city of Florence, so not only the wool guild, but also the city in itself, and in particular the San Giovanni neighborhood in the heart of the city. Though his father, Pepo's father, Antonio, was by far one of the most prolific, influential members, both economically and politically, Pepo himself also held public office in the neighborhood of San Giovanni in Florence at least once, for what we know, as we can see in records of many Priorista manuscripts. You can see in the middle right there his name. We know from records of Florentine tratte holders in the office holders in the Florentine archives that Pepo also held public and political offices other times. So for example, he was gonfaloniere di compagnia at least twice in 1352 and 1367, and buon uomo at least once in 1359. So quite a powerful person and family also politically. The Albizi power and influence, political, economic, cultural, reached its peak, I would say, between 1300 and 1430. It was therefore a bit surprising for me to find that very little documentation about the family remains, especially regarding the Middle Ages. Even after consulting the Albizi Frescobaldi archive in Remole, where I took these photos 2 summers ago, whose catalog is now accessible online thanks to the work of Ilaria Marcelli, I immediately realized that very few materials date back to the medieval period. Pepo's memorial book is, in fact, the oldest surviving manuscript of the family, and therefore serves as a fundamental material resource to reconstruct and often correct the story of Pepo and his family. And it is, quite extraordinarily, in Chicago. Last but not least, Pepo were not only, and his family were not only people of commerce, they were also, as it often happened at the time, people of letters. Just to mention a few examples, Alberto, Pepo's first son and main heir, has been at the center of attention of literary scholars and historians, far less for his role in the family business, which was indeed prominent, but much more for his poetry. Among Pepo's immediate family members, we can count no less than 4 poets, including Riccardo di Franceschino, one of Pepo's business partners, who mostly managed international commerce for Pepo's company, and Riccardo's son, Franceschino, who was a poet himself and one of Francesco Petrarca's closest friends, as we know from many of Petrarch's letters. So, just quickly going back to the manuscript itself, the Albizi Memorial Book presents many of the typical characteristics of Florentine merchant books, primarily in its material structure, binding fasciculation, its page layout, its script, and its formulaic language. Partly ledger, like we said, and partly diary, partly memorial and partly account book, Pepo's manuscript is entirely autographed, that is in his own hand, with almost no emendation. It is indeed a unique text preserved in a single copy, as it is true for most books of this kind. Objects such as ledgers were in fact often written out, consulted, and conserved in a single location, and were never really destined for circulation beyond the family walls. The uniqueness of the personal copy creates intricate intertextual links within the book itself, and with similar volumes belonging to other members of the same family. These were books that to be used, originating and functioning in a very practical culture, the mercantile culture, and used to record and measure in many senses goods and time. While the merchant book is often described as a poor book produced using paper in a small format without ruling, Pepo's ledger seems indeed to defy this definition, at least in part. Why? For many reasons. The cover in itself is quite incredible. It's an Italian tacketed ledger or stationary binding with functioning buckle and original buckle, as it was typical of refined high-class ledgers in medieval Florence. Pepo's book is defined by its distinct color, the high-quality deer leather that binds the fascicles together is dyed in Brazil wood to a dark pink color. It's quite stunning to see in person. Reflecting common practice regarding merchant books of the time, Pepo refers to other ledgers belonging to his father Antonio and to the Fondaco, the warehouse, by mentioning their color. Libro Rosso del Fondaco, the warehouse red book, Libro Giallo d'Antonio, Antonio's yellow book, and Libro Arancio del Fondaco, the orange book of the warehouse. Other typical characteristics, and here is the Libro Giallo d'Antonio, the yellow book belonging to Antonio. Other typical characteristics of high quality book are the use of parchment and not paper, the overall quality of its other materials, confirming, should that be necessary, of the wealth of its owner. The manuscript's own structure suggests that the fascicles of the book were assembled and sewed before Pepo started using and writing the book. The general page layout that you can see here of the manuscript is also very typical of account books of the time, with the text organized in unruled columns, transaction summary on the left, and sum to be paid on the right, or received, paid or received on the right, with business transactions that were crossed out by the merchant himself when paid. The Newbery manuscript opens with an invocation to God and the Virgin Mary and all saints, like also was typical of the time, and with an ownership record. Here, Pepo calls himself as the author and owner of the book itself. On the opening page, Pepo also indexed the organization of the book into 3 parts. He tells us that from Carte 1 to 22, he will transcribe matters of mercancia, merchant matters, and records of his credits. From Carte 22 to 32, matters of mercancia again, but records of his debts. And from Carta 32 on, he will write additional personal memories, not necessarily related to his business. So that's the more diary part of the book. Ironically, fascicle number 4, that contained most of the records of his debts, from Carta 25 to 32, is actually cut off and now missing. There is really a clear evidence of the fascicle being cut off and not just lost It's still very evident if you go and look at the book. Of course, I'm not drawing any conclusion here. That would be completely mere conjectures, but it's, let's say, at least interesting to notice that that one is the fascicle that was at some point cut off. In any case, Pepo's carefully planned indexing at the beginning of his book testifies to a writing that was both extemporaneous, records of daily matters, but also carefully calculated. It also testified to a merchant writer of wealth and high cultural status who had a clear vision of how his book had to be organized and of the physical space at his disposal. The language that Pepo uses is highly standardized and formulaic, especially in his introduction, as well as the first two parts of the book. This is the indexing. So this still seems to suggest that the idea of merchants as being poorly trained in letters, especially medieval merchants, but Pepo's language is yes standardized, but we have to remember that some Florentine merchants had quite a fair amount of writerly competence and textual awareness, and that should lead us really not to dismiss their texts as purely non-literary. Pepo's book represented an open-ended kind of writing, always in theory and always open to new additions, but at the same time, again, very formally self-conscious. So this oscillation between formulaic expressions, speech-like phrases, and more formal expressions can be found throughout the entire book. Especially in those sections of the text where Pepo wrote more personal matters, his use of the language becomes much less formal and less standardized, allowing us really a more unfiltered glimpse into his life and his cultural apparatus. What makes Pepo's memorial book an object of extraordinary value is, though, it's the personal, social, and historical information contained in its pages, which give us really a first-hand access into the life of a wealthy 14th century merchant intertwined with groundbreaking historical events and socio-economic changes. So let's have a quick look at a few of these contents of the book. Pepo's memorial book starts in January 1340 with the recording of his first two weddings, both marriages very brief and ending quite abruptly. His first wife, Cianghella, married Pepo in January 1340 and died soon thereafter on July 7th of the same year, possibly due to a plague that erupted in Florence in the spring of 1340 and was narrated by Giovanni Villani in his chronicles. A similar story for Pepo's second wife, Contessa, married in May 1341 and died possibly of childbirth only 9 months after their wedding in February 1349. These marriages celebrated Pepo and celebrated when Pepo was still in his teenage years, contributed actually to building his personal wealth. The dowry for each wedding amounted to 1,000 florins, which was quite a good amount of money for the time, drastically increasing his personal wealth to 2,000 florins beyond the earnings he collected while working in his father's business. After the death of Contessa, Pepo would not marry again for 11 years. And his third wife, Francesca, whom Pepo married in January 1353, gave birth to four of his sons, 4 sons and 3 daughters. Alberto, their firstborn, Jacopa, Andrea, Filippa, Nicolao and Paolo, and Piera. But let's go actually to the page and the paragraph that makes this manuscript the star of the Newbery collection and of incredible interest for historians, literary scholars, art historians, and beyond. We are on Carta 35 verso. Before looking at the specific paragraph, that is the last one on your left, I want to quickly have a look at the entire page because the organization of this page and the content is really an exemplar of the entire diary and shows clearly the constant cross-fertilizations of personal information, historical events, business accounts in Pepo's book. Pepo, in fact, begins the page by transcribing a corporation contract stipulated in January 1351 and already recorded elsewhere in his brother's by his brother Lando in his own memorial book. After writing the first few lines of the contract, Pepo suddenly interrupts the transcription and announces a change of topic, and I translate. I will not continue to transcribe the given company contract because before that I have to write about other personal matters that had to be written beforehand. So he interrupts, he clearly interrupts also visually with these cross-outs, with intersecting lines, and then starts writing about something widely different. This sudden interruption is triggered by the need to record a personal event that occurred about a year and a half earlier, which is the birth of his first child, an illegitimate, as he calls, daughter, whom Pepo does not hesitate to recognize directly as his own. That's what he says with my rough translation. Though it is at times dubious if illegitimate children are of the person they are given to, she is certainly mine, confirmed by any possible proof and with clarity and certainty. And he goes on clarifying for the record that, and I translate again, when I acquired her, I did not have a wife and the mother of the child did not have a husband. So just for the record, there was no extramarital affair here. And Margherita, as the child will later be named, is actually Pepo's first daughter and is extraordinarily, she appears in another page of the manuscript because she's mentioned in Pepo's first will. And this is quite extraordinary because first she's a daughter and then she's what he calls an illegitimate daughter. And no other daughters of Pepo appear anywhere in his wills. So this is quite extraordinary also socially. So completing the page is the list of his close family members who died in 1348 from the Black Death. This is really one of the rare first-hand accounts, personal historical accounts of the Black Death impact on Pepo's family and his work life. I suggest everybody that is interested in the Black Death to look at the MAA webinar and list of references that were put together by Monica Green and Joris Rosen that are trying to really frame the Black Death as an essentially non-Eurocentric event and predating it by almost 1 century. Going back to Florence though, most historians agree that the plague killed around 1/3 of the European population, that portions increases in places like Florence, probably the structure of the walled city, precarious sanitary conditions are believed really to have made the Florentine death count spike to between 1/2 and 2/3 of the European population. In fact, Pepo's personal account confirms these theories. Precisely half of his immediate family died in the summer of 1348 within less than 2 months. Imagine, within 6 weeks in June and July 1348, Pepo lost his father, Antonio, his stepmother, Giovanna, his nephew, Giano, while out of his 13 siblings, he lost 7 of them, 3 brothers and 4 sisters. So quite extraordinary. Imagining within 6 weeks, lose more than half of your immediate family. The mortalità, though, not only impacted Pepo's personal life, but also had evident effect on the family business. Before the Black Death, Pepo's husband, Antonio, ran the company, with his sons as soci, but as was typical for Florentine businesses of the time, and the role was filled by all male sons, but one who in Pepo's words was unable to participate in the family business. And this is another of those extraordinary moments in the manuscript in which Pepo talks about the disability of his brother. So after the Black Death, the company had to undergo an entire restructuring, and the numbers of the profits, of course, went down. So we can really see materially that the Black Death marked the peak of the family business. And even though Pepo's sons went on to maintain a good business, after 1348, the revenues really never reached the levels of 1347. So it's quite an extraordinary object, full of extraordinary firsthand accounts of what Florence was at the time. And this kind of books are often overlooked, especially by literary scholars, because they're of course not part of the canonical texts that we read, but they really can give us information that we would rarely have otherwise, because they're so personal and they really give a window into the real life in many senses: historical, literary, social, and many other ways. So building a digital edition, I'm going to skip a couple of slides and just brief introduction. While the use of digital technology in literary and textual studies has steadily grown in recent decades with the production of various digital-born editions, the intersection between computing, literary, and philological studies dates back to the first half of the 20th century, years before the beginning of the internet and of the World Wide Web in the 1980s. Although the first computational projects were mainly related to concordances, linguistic studies, the endeavors later expanded to a different range of humanities discipline, history, literature, visual arts, and so on. The advent of the era of the World Wide Web allowed for the expansion of the frontiers of textual visualization, both in terms of digitization of images, of material sources, and in terms of text encoding. Editors saw in these new digital promises not only potentials for the exploration of different aspects of their own work, but also for the ability to reach new and enlarged groups of users. It is really further developments of text encoding standards, among which the TEI, have since then increasingly expanded the potentials for textual scholars to produce digital editions that are less print-like. So good news, we've come a long way. We've been around for almost a century. Bad/good news, we still have a lot to go. There are infinite potentials to create digital scholarship that is truly digital born, and to think digital while producing it. Let's go back to the Albizi. 2 seconds, why digital? From the most obvious answers: openness, scholarly economy, openness, a simultaneous presence of different layers of information that otherwise we would need a lot of printed pages to fill, while here can be all in one virtual space. This, of course, has effects on interpretation, potential effects on interpretations, the transparency of scholarship that can be achieved through the digital, the uses that can be made of the digital scholarship as a learning pedagogical tool, and the reusable aspect of digital scholarship, both in terms of content and in terms of infrastructure. So what will the digital edition, Albizi Digital Edition have? High resolution images of the entire manuscript, that is already digitized, transcription, diplomatic, and edited, so more normalized. Hopefully a translation slowly starting from most relevant passages in the manuscript. This, I think it's essential to open up even more the manuscript to non-Italian scholars. Commentaries, an interactive geotemporal timeline, which will really be the center of the website because of the nature of the manuscript, with spatial and temporal visualizations of the information of the manuscript. And I would love to also develop a pedagogical section of the site in which not only about textual and manuscript information, but also on materials on how to build digital editions, how to encode historical documents, and so on. Very, very quickly, I want to conclude with a couple of reflections on text encoding and the importance of having humanities scholars and having brilliant graduate students learn the technical gigs of our work. Because although they might seem really like complete opposites, the physical materiality of the handwritten manuscripts, but also of the early printed books, and the script of digital code have really remarkable interconnections. It is not surprising that we talk about code both in terms of material literary production, the codex, and in terms of the series of alphanumeric instructions used to represent the text on the web, the code. This intrinsic relationship between material and digital transcriptions, with the development and the use of markup languages like TEI to digitally encode handwritten texts, this profound interconnection reach really new depths and often can reach new depths and often unexpected results. So what is TEI? For the ones of you that are not familiar with it, it's text encoding is the process of adding tags or marks to a text that needs to be digitally transcribed. These tags that you can see, a couple of very, very, very simple ones here. So these tags can be applied to different portions of a text, from a single letter to indicate a capital, abbreviations, erasures, to entire words to specify the nature and function or formatting of the word itself, to entire lines or even bigger portions of the text to signal, for example, beginning and ending of paragraphs, chapters, poetic genres, line groups, stanzas, and so on. Moreover, these tags have the potentials to describe not only the textual and prosodic features of the text or series of texts, but also its material and visual characteristics, the disposition of the text itself on the page, different kinds of transcriptions, variants, interventions, visual elements, use of blank space, and so on. We can therefore consider text encoding as a language that essentially assigns a tag to a term or a material, textual material phenomenon, inevitably also adding our own interpretation of the texts themselves. And this is where the training in textual studies and material studies, manuscript studies really comes into play. When we choose which tags to add to a text, we do a lot of humanities work as well, a lot of work as textual scholars. So as it is already clear from these very, very, very basic examples, even the microscopic material aspects of a handwritten text are not solely connected to the strip of digital code, but they are materially embedded in it. Encoding can be at the same time limiting and limitless, which is the best part of it and the worst part of it. Limiting because it is in itself an interpretation of the text, and there are limited ways in which you can use the different tags which give strict and precise definitions to certain parts of the text itself, but also limitless because potentially one could apply a vast number of tags to any part of a text. While tags also allow to explain exploit the utility of searchability. Anything that is clearly marked with a tag is easily searchable within the encoding itself and in the web realization. You can create visualizations, you can create indexes, you can create an infinitive amount of new digital scholarship from a well-tagged text. But there are also, they are also powerful tools that need to be need a substantial balance in their application. The risk of over-tagging, for example, and therefore in a way depriving the actual text of their centrality is to be carefully considered while encoding. The editorial choices to face while preparing the encoding of a literary text also revolve around the choices of what parts of the text to encode and with how much details. Nevertheless, the act of digitally translating the materiality of the handwritten codex entails a precision representing textual and material features that can potentially really reach a depth that go beyond what we even already have in digital editions. It is fundamental, though, already from this conclusion that I've prepared, on one side to establish standards and tag sets, and on the other side that humanities scholars are involved in the process of establishing standards and tag sets, which means when students often ask me, or my colleagues ask me, so how much do I need to know to be part of a digital project, to do a digital project? How much of the technical part do I need to know? What I respond is, I think at the minimum, understand the language. Be able to speak to the technical people about the language. There will always be some more technical person in the project with you. Most of the times that happens, 99% of the times. But the way you're able to understanding the language and to talking to the technical person, that's, I think, what makes the difference in digital projects. And that's what I encourage all the young graduate students and researchers to not be afraid, learn these languages, understand their logic behind them, and only, I think, only in this way we can really advance from that initial phase of digital scholarship that has lasted a few decades to the next steps that will come from here on. And these are just few examples of the things that I am tagging in my prototypes in the Albizi book, and because of what I've told you about the nature of this manuscript, of course, one of the things that I'll tag is the layers of the edition, facsimile images, diplomatic, edited, and commentary and translation. There will always all be tagged in the TI files. And I want to try to maintain both the material and textual, some of the material and textual elements, because I think both are important. Materially, because of the distribution of the text on the manuscript page, that is really, it really defines the genre, let's say. The use of space, the use of columns and blank space, but also the textual features, especially the intertextuality, both in terms of references within the books and references of time and space and everything like that. So these are just a few examples, and I had a few examples, and we can maybe look at them during the questions, because I think I took already way too much time. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mani. So we should move over to the Q&A section of the talk. I will allow you all to unmute yourselves, and I will re-enable the chat. As a quick note, I can't see everybody on my one screen, so waving at me to get my attention might not work. So I'd suggest using the raise hand feature in Zoom, or otherwise just saying I have a question in the chat if you don't want to type it out. I do see Ian though.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Isabella, for that fabulous presentation, such a fascinating book that you've found. I have a question about how what recommendations you can give and how you're thinking about avoiding the problem of siloing of digital projects. You flashed up, I saw just very briefly the Piers Plowman Electronic Archive flash up. And one of the problems with that project is that it doesn't link out to other resources, and it doesn't provide, at present, very good ways for affiliated projects to link in to it. How will you deal with this problem?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important point. And I can think of many wonderful projects that I wish would talk to each other a little more. So this is, I think, very important. I think on my end, talking about this project, I think for what I know, there are not editions that of this type of books out there, digital editions. But of course, it relates to the many TEI digital editions that are out there. Of course, Petrarchive and many others. But I think this is really one of the next steps of digital projects to try to, I don't mean really go away from individual projects, but try to have more a connection between projects. And in some types of projects, it's much easier to do. And database kind of environment. For digital editions, I feel for now, we really have individual projects that don't really talk to each other as much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Marta.
Sorry, I couldn't find my hand. I actually have a question that sort of relates to Ian's, but I think it takes things in a different direction. And that's that you're working on a kind of object that people don't often work on, the single object, right? The single copy. You're not talking about something that has a long tradition of printing or other kinds of even circulation. And yet these objects are, as I think your talk so beautifully demonstrates, right, they are so resonant. And I'm wondering if there isn't a way, right, of thinking about some of these, that the very idea of the single object as a kind of digital space, how many different single objects could somehow be connected. I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure what people are working on necessarily in your field in this way, but I think about lots of sort of 19th century objects in my own field and how we don't yet have a way of connecting them or even thinking really about the single object and its value. And I think this project does that really, really beautifully. I have a very practical question about some of your data visualizations. And I noticed that in one part of the presentation, a beautiful map of Florence flashed onto the screen. And I wondered, are you doing something with that? Are you, is part of the, are you thinking in terms of, you talked about time, right? And the kind of temporality that's so essential to this project. Are you thinking of ways of conceiving space and time together? And how, what are your thoughts about the data visualizations? What might some of them look like?
Absolutely. And responding to your first question and also going back to Ian's question, I think it was part that I skipped at the very end of the project. My goal that right now seems very far away, but I would really love to build, of course, this edition. Like you mentioned, this is a very unique object. There are no other copies, there are no variants, there are no printed editions or even other manuscripts. There could be potentially other manuscripts that overlap a little bit, like I talked about. There were other family books from the same families that were circulating and sometimes overlapped information, but unfortunately this is the only existing one for the Albizi family, at least. So in a way it is unique, the edition in itself, but I think in the future I would love to really create a number of editions of these types of books, perhaps to include in a database of these types of books, because I think they are, like you mentioned, like very understudied, but because they're never shiny objects, they're not part of our canon. But I think, and they're mostly, when they're studied, they're mostly studied by historians, but I think there is also a relevance for other researchers, like literary scholars like I am, to study these books. And they share a lot of characteristics, especially material characteristics. So in this sense, editions talking to each other would be much easier to visualize. And in like maybe a framework of a database. So that's the first question. That is my ideal future goal. But certainly space goes with time, definitely. This is something I've been thinking about for the past few months, and actually something I've been thinking about also for the Petrotype project, the other digital edition I'm working on. And I think in that sense, visualizations of time and space, there are a lot of tools right now that allow you, that help do that. But I think there is a lot more to explore digitally. So that's while I'm very familiar with TI and that part of the edition, once I settle on sets of tags, will go with itself quite easily. I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think the part that I want to spend most of my digital energies is to precisely these temporal spatial dimensions that are so central in the book itself in terms of the information and everything. So, but I'm not settled on anything that is out there right now digitally. So I would love to experiment, but that's the next step. But that would be certainly one of the central parts of the edition beyond the texts.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we are a bit short on time, but I do have 2 questions in the queue and another one coming up. We want to start with Paul. Oh, Paul, you're still muted.
Isabella, that was such a fascinating paper. I'm so happy to have heard it, and congratulations on having made such a find.
Thank you. And thank you for waking up at 6 a.m.
Oh, it was worth it. I noticed that you're intending to do a facsimile presentation and a diplomatic presentation with all of the deletions and additions and so on, and also I think an edited reading text. All of that sounded very, very sensible to me. I have to warn you that I'm a bit of a TEI skeptic, so I'm just wondering, given that you're going to be doing facsimiles, and given that facsimiles, we sort of think of them perhaps as static things, but yet when we look at facsimiles, we can elicit a great deal of information just from looking. That is to say, the image is full of information. So I'm just wondering what advantages you're anticipating from coding this spatial and visual information. So I'd just like to know where your early thinking is on that. Like, let's say, is it going to be worth the effort when you've already got the facsimiles?
Right. The most, I would say, the most immediate textual advantage is that this is a really hard script to read. But that's only merely in a textual context. The Mercantesca script is, at least for me, the hardest medieval Italian vernacular script to read. So, but that's very superficial level. So having a transcription, both in the diplomatic form and in a more normalized, modernized form, would help in a superficial level reading the texts. But I think there are many ways in which I think we can explore spatial and dimensions in manuscripts. And I can show you an example. I think I have it in the slides, let me check, of another project, the other projects that I'm working on with Professor Story, the Pet Archive. So there are many ways in which the digital through the encoding can go beyond the textual representation that I've been talking about so far and explore the digital. So with digital revisualizations of the text, for example, in this case, there is a digital representation of what you said. Like, I completely agree. The material visual aspects of the manuscript beyond the text tells you so much of the text itself, even beyond reading the text itself. So, of course, Petrarch's texts are very different from the manuscript that I'm working on right now. But I think having only the facsimile without the transcription and encoding of the text would really take away some layers of representation.
Oh, sorry, perhaps I wasn't clear. I didn't mean don't have transcriptions. That's exactly, I think, of course, what you should have. No, I'm just wondering whether the encoding of the facsimile itself, or sorry, the encoding of like the blank spaces, the fact that there are two columns, or the fact that this piece of text has been inserted over in the gutter, or at the foot, or at the head of the page in some white space. That kind of spatial information. Sometimes it's possible you just look at it and you can see it, and as you're reading the transcription, it's rather easy to locate it if you want to locate it for your particular purpose.
Yeah, I think in this, at least for this type of book, though, the way the text is displayed on the manuscript page is also significant. I think the way the place in which information appears, it's also significant and tells you something about the text itself. So I think that's why it's important to encode that side of the book as well. But I can see what you're saying. But I think having that in the encoding, I think it's really important in this case, because it's really a fundamental part of the book.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
I always
So, oh, sorry.
Skeptics.
So we will have our last question. Looks like Wayne, you had something to ask?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
Good. Thank you, Isabella. This is, you know, I love this project, and I wanted to sort of engage a little bit of sort of thinking. Marta, you might want to mute yourself. Okay. There we go. And it follows up a little bit on Paul's question, I think. When I think about the nature of zibaldoni, notebooks, even of famous writers in both in Italian and French, for example, a lot of them haven't even been treated to editions, in spite of the fact that they're holographs, precisely because the visual orientation of those early texts, those early works, don't translate well onto a modern page. And I suppose, and I think about the Libro del Biadaiolo, or the Book of the Grain Merchant, by Domenico Laenzi in the early 1340s, late 1330s, that had an edition in, I think, in the late 1970s, but had great trouble sort of translating into a modern look the way the text should be read. And in fact, when you look at the manuscript, it looks like another work altogether. And I suppose my question is then, since layout of these various books also translates into, is a sort of representation of how these merchants and how family members who wrote these wonderful memorial books thought as well, the structure of their thought. Have you considered a way to sort of translate? Is it necessary to translate into, or to disentangle a little bit that thinking on the page that occurs?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, like both Paul's and yours question, in precisely in trying to come up with tag sets that translates different aspects of the work. I agree. I think that the disposition of the text on the manuscript pages, that it's really, if you look at memorial books by merchants in the Middle Ages, but even the early modern ones in manuscripts, the way in which the text was written is quite similar. And like you said, it not only reflects a textual, visual, aesthetics of the page, but really the way they were thinking and the way they were recording information. So I think it's something that I'm struggling with right now and thinking about right now, like how to translate this that is not merely a content and textual aspect of it. That's of course the easiest to digitally translate, and to maintain it in a significant way and also in a readable way. So it is definitely something I'm.
Yeah, no, this question of, I think it's fascinating, and I really admire you for taking it on. This notion of categories of thought, basically, that are not just separate, but also on the page interconnect, and obviously are shared in more than just a temporal sense. So I think it's a fascinating issue that deserves attention, but also deserves perhaps some theory unto its and praxis unto itself. So thank you very much.
It will be quite a challenge, but we are here to take challenge, right?
So Andrew, I think I want to just thank everyone so much that was able to come and spend some time here today, and just extraordinary thanks to our speaker, and also great thanks to Marta Werner as Svaglik Chair in terms of co-sponsorship of the talk, And we hope that we see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.